Hey, if you're wondering about the smoke, I'm burning incense, so that's that. Theresa May once again visited or some of the victims of the Grenfell Tower disaster, and as she left the building, I don't know if it was a local community centre or something, she was not only heckled, but really at close range. In fact, I was wondering what the security were doing. It seemed a little bit sloppy security to me, given that this is the Prime Minister. There were people basically saying, "Oh, here she is," and booing her. Even children were in on it. I don't like to see this sort of stuff. I think it's ugly, and of course, she's not the first, and she won't be the last prime minister to face heckles. But there is something particularly ugly about what is being directed at Theresa May, and I want to just express how I feel about this. Um, Firstly, we all know this was a horrible, horrible tragedy, and I'm not going to say I understand. I cannot claim to understand that I would never ever judge people's emotions who have lost everything, who've had their homes destroyed, who've had relatives literally incinerated. I can't imagine the nightmare that that brings. So I would never tell those people directly that you cannot feel that way. But the thing is, I think a lot of these protests against May are not necessarily directly people who have lost loved ones or lost their properties. I think they may be people from the area who are sort of garnering into a scapegoating mentality, and I don't like it. I think the PM's sort of in a non-winnable position because she initially didn't turn up. Now, that was probably a big mistake, and I'll come back to that in a second. But she was heavily criticised for that. So, what happens when she does turn up? She gets jeered and booed. It's like she's going to get criticised no matter what she does, and that seems a bit unfair. I think it's unfair to blame this awful tragedy on one individual. Yes, Theresa May was Home Secretary for 6 years and she's been Prime Minister for a year. So she's been in government for some time. But the building itself, as I understand it, was built in 1974, which makes it during the second Wilson administration, which was a Labour government. So there are a lot of things to look at. Definitely the cladding seems to be the main issue that escalated the fire, but there are a lot of things to look at, and I think blaming Theresa May alone, or even the Conservative Party alone, is misguided. I think that if we look at the history of the Tower, 43 years, that's a mixture of Tory and Labour administrations. So for Labour to sort of capitalise on this, I initially defended Jeremy Corbyn. I said, well, he has a right to ask questions. And I do believe that he does. But I also feel to some extent Labour is exploiting this. We've just come out of an election, the results of which no one really anticipated. Labour done better than expected. The Tories done worse than expected. Labour have arrogantly claimed they have a right to govern. I don't believe that they do. They lost. Doing well doesn't mean that you have a right to govern. So I think Corbyn and McDonnell have sort of been acting like because May is weakened, they automatically have a right to govern. It doesn't work that way. And, whatever way you look at it, Labour got less seats than the Tories. Um, so I think it's unfortunate that the PM is being as vilified as she is. She didn't wake up on the 14th of May and say, oh, I hope 79 people burned to death in a building today. This was a horrible tragedy. It may be a higher figure. It was a horrible tragedy. But this ultimately was an accident. I'm not going to say it's God's will. It wasn't. It could have been prevented if I think one of the major issues here is that residents had repeatedly voiced concerns about safety. Now, that is a complete disgrace that that wasn't listened to. And I do think there will be a cause for corporate manslaughter charges. I think there will be some cause for that. But I still think it's different from, for example, a terrorist attack, which is a deliberate attempt to kill people. This was negligence. This was not, I think murder is a very loaded term. Although I do understand why emotions are running so high. I mean, if you've lost everything, you can't tell people to calm down and you can't tell people not to feel angry and upset. Of course, they're going to feel that way. But what I find interesting is the people who've been heckling me don't look to me like people who have been directly I don't know because they look. I could be dead wrong about this, but they just look like they've kind of been. They almost. I won't say brought in, but orchestrated. Someone who'd lost everything would be visibly very. They'd be crying. They'd be really upset. These people are almost. To me, it just doesn't look like people who were directly involved in that. I don't know that. I might be dead wrong, but regardless, I think that Labour need to start showing some responsibility as well. It's easy for Jeremy Corbyn to pontificate. He's never ever had ministerial office of any kind. So I don't know. Surely this is something that they're pointing fingers isn't going to be particularly helpful. Everyone wants answers, and the victims need to be given accommodation. And apparently that has been happening. Apparently there's been luxury flats in South London. Some of them have been sent there. As I understand, some are also being told they'll have to go to Birmingham and Manchester, which is obviously would be terrible, expecting people to move to an entirely different city. This is a horrible situation. I believe this is the Hillsborough of our times. What I mean by that is this is a disaster that's becoming incredibly politicized. For right or wrong, that is what is happening. So that is why it is important that at this early stage, all the facts are established. I do think there is a cause to make that there's corporate manslaughter, but to say that Theresa May is personally responsible, I think is a bit unfair. I personally think the Tory cuts have a lot to answer for, but I don't think you can blame Tory cuts on every single problem in the country. And I also understand that when there is such a glaring wealth poverty gap, especially in a single borough, a single seat, North Kensington. Actually, the seat is Kensington and Chelsea. Obviously, that is going to inflame passions, and it's human nature. When you have such a contrast of such wealth and such deprivation in, a few streets away from one another, it's human nature that that's going to inflame passions. I mean, like I said, I'm really being careful here not to judge these people. If I'd lost everything, if family members had died, I'd lost my property, I'd probably be enraged. But I feel like May is being condemned no matter what she does. Now, in terms of not visiting immediately, why didn't she do that? Well, it could have been two things. It could have been that she feared a hostile response, which is not really a reason not to go, because you're prime minister, you have to take the heat when it comes. On the other hand, it could well be that her staff advised her that she would have been getting in the way of the emergency services. When politicians, I remember when there was floods in the south of England a while back, people were saying, "Oh, the politicians are just here for photo shoots," and yet if they don't show up, people say, "Oh, they don't care." So you have to make your mind up. You can't criticize elected representatives for not showing up if all you're going to do is attack them when they do show up. I'm not saying people have to be overly polite, especially under the circumstances. People are understandably emotional, but at least be fair. Um, Theresa May is she's trying to do the right thing by visiting these community centres, and she's just getting abused for it. I don't think it's fair. And I'm saying this as someone who I am not a conservative. There's a lot of Tory areas I despise, quite honestly. I do think the Tories have a lot to answer for in terms of cuts, but I don't think you can entirely put this on cuts. There's a lot of different bodies responsible for the management of the Grenfell Tower, and therefore there's collective responsibility at stake here. To blame one individual, I think, is a bit unfair. But there's other issues going on here. It is getting ugly. There was unpleasant scenes in the borough council hall. There was also an unfortunate incident where a man who was actually a volunteer was falsely accused of being a Tory councillor, and he was basically attacked. Now, my point would be even if he was a Tory councillor, the fact is he had done his part to try and help out. No one should be treated that way. And this is what happens when, I don't want to say a mob mentality, but when a scapegoat mentality develops. And there are certain people, cough, cough, Mr. Corbyn, Mr. McDonnell, are not exactly helping to de escalate things. I'm not saying they shouldn't be asking questions, but at least they should be acting like responsible politicians and not deliberately stirring up emotions. I think yeah, that it's sort of another angle I've taken with this, and I do think it's a little bit unfair. Let me know your thoughts. Thanks for watching.